As you've learned, data can be considered a commodity, a source of revenue. Nonetheless, when it comes to data, they're not all the same. There are different types of data, and according to the different type, there are differences and sometimes overlaps that should be considered and followed by those that want to work in this lucrative business. As I've said before, there are different types of data and consequently different rules that should be considered. Since personal data are the more interesting data from an economic but also a legal perspective value, it is useful to start describing the main laws and related rules and principles that apply to these valuable assets. The first and most important legislation, which most of you already know, is the General Data Protection Regulation, or the so-called GDPR. The GDPR is a legislation that has been approved and entered into force almost 2 years ago. The GDPR rules apply, with some exceptions, in the same way within all the European Union. From a business perspective, this is good news, because it means that once you follow the rules, you can do your business in all the European Union without the need to adapt your business to different national rules. Isn't that great? The GDPR foresees rules and safeguards related to the processing of personal data. It also provides clear definitions of all those elements and entities that are involved in the processing activities of such data. When you start doing a business that involves data, you will need to understand if you're dealing with personal or non-personal data. According to the GDPR definition, personal data are all the information that can be, directly or indirectly, linked to a certain person called a data subject. For example, an address is a personal data, a like or a comment on Facebook is a personal data, but also your IP address falls into the GDPR definition. And the good news is that if the data that you're using cannot be qualified as personal data, you do not have to follow the GDPR rules. The bad news is that considering the GDPR personal data definition, a vast amount of data are indeed personal data. Besides the definition of personal data, it is useful to mention the one of processing of personal data. Processing is the legal term that is used to define all the activities that involve personal data. Similarly to the definition of personal data, the GDPR definition of processing is quite broad. In fact, it includes all sorts of activities, such as the collection, the consultation, but also the so-called anonymization. Anonymization is the process that transforms personal into non-personal data, and consequently avoiding, if correctly done for those who do it, to follow the GDPR rules, since the future activities will no longer involve personal data. And last but not least, it is essential to mention the provisions related to the roles in the personal data processing supply chain. In every situation involving personal data, there are at least two entities: the data owner, called the data subject, and the data controller, which is the entity that processes and decides the purpose of the processing activity. In addition to these two entities, other individuals or companies might be involved in the processing activities. The data controller might allocate some tasks and consequently responsibilities to another subject or entity defined as the processor. The processor has fewer responsibilities compared to the data controller ones, like those related to security. And besides, if the company that is leading the processing data, and well, the different companies that are leading the processing data are more than one, they usually share responsibilities and are consequently called joint controllers. In order to clarify who is responsible for what, the GDPR requires these parties to draft a contract where roles and responsibilities are well defined. Once we have a better understanding of what is personal data and what is not, we can clarify some key characteristics and consequently differences between personal data and other data. Differently from all other products and data, personal data are not a commodity. While the GDPR does not prohibit the processing of personal data, it prevents to consider personal data as a commodity. In fact, individuals, the data subjects, will always retain fundamental rights in relation to the data related to them, even if they're giving it away for receiving a service like watching a movie. Together with the laws and the rules foreseen within each law, there are also some ethical principles that should be taken into account. Ethical principles are essential because they are used to support and interpret the law. In the context of processing and selling personal data, the European Data Protection Supervisor Authority, the EDPS, has developed ethical guidelines. A clear takeaway from the ethical principles developed within the EDPS and also included in the GDPR concerns the rights of the data subjects to not be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, What does that mean? It means that human dignity has to be preserved and that a processing activity should not undermine or harm individuals. That was all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.